Joining us are Dr. Tristan Beyer, who's the crop nutrition lead at the Mosaic Company. Dr. Kent Martin, who is the owner of Martin Agronomic and Environmental Consulting, and Ron Olson, the senior agronomist at the Sulfur Institute. Ron, at this time, I will turn the webinar over to you, and you may further introduce yourselves and begin your presentation. And I promised a couple chat drops. I'll send those over in a second. And Ron, Tristan, I'll be making you presenter here. So you should see a prompt shortly. Okay, looks good.
Good morning, everyone. We're glad to have you on this webinar this morning. Thank you Marie, for the introduction. I'm teamed up with two really great collaborators and sulfur experts this morning as we present the topic Sulfur's Emergence as an Essential Crop Nutrient. One of the takeaway messages that we want to leave you today is that really leave this webinar realizing that sulfur really is the fourth major crop nutrient. Dr. Tristan Beyer, I've had the good fortune to know him for a number of years as he was doing his postgraduate work and entering the industry. So we're glad to have Tristan here. He's the crop nutrition lead with the Mosaic Company. Dr. Kent Martin, I've had the pleasure of working with and knowing Kent as he was doing his postgraduate, undergraduate work and then his graduate work at K-State. We're glad to have Kent on the team this morning. And I have the good fortune of being the agronomist for the Sulfur Institute. This morning, we're going to be dealing with some sulfur background. And I know that as CCAs, you're saying, wow, we already know a lot about that. Well, you know, one of the things that I've learned over my almost 46 year career is that we have to learn our techniques and keep sharpening the saw. So this is all about spaced repetition. So I don't think we're going to have things that you are going to be bored with as we go through this session. We want to tell you about the Sulfur Institute. This is the first time that TSI has collaborated with ASA to do a webinar of this nature. We want to give you some background there and then dig into the importance of sulfur, the historic recommendations and how they've been changing, and then leave you some resources and things to be thinking about. So why is the Sulfur Institute, why do we spell sulfur in this unique way? Well, there's a story there. This is the formal name of the Sulfur Institute. We use the English spelling of that, that really started with the Greek philosophers and scholars when they spelled sulfur, S-U-L-P-H-U-R, and the Greek letter phi represents the F sound. So for geographical reference, we use sulfur, S-U-L-F-U-R, in the United States, but S-U-L-P-H-U-R in British English, in Irish, South African, and Indian English. Now, both spellings, just to make it confusing, are used in Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand English. So that's our story, and we're going to stick to that on why we spell sulfur the way we do. The Sulfur Institute is focused on championing the essential benefits of sulfur that are provided by sulfur. Sulfur, we really believe that sulfur is an element that improves people's lives. And as you study about it, and as you've experienced it in your own career, it's really fits that vision. Our mission is in creating member value by driving sustainability, advocacy, and connections for the sulfur industry stakeholders. We are really the global association for sulfur and sulfuric acid professionals. At the Sulfur Institute, we really are focused on providing value, and we want to call it out. When we are doing this, we say we are TSI strong. We're TSI strong when we focus on making professional connections. We're TSI strong when we work with our member companies to develop industry-leading practices. We are, with our weekly and monthly newsletters and information we share, we're really inspiring and directing some thought leadership ideas to our membership. We do consultancy as needed for our members. Education and training is a real key part of what we do to talk about the importance of safety, of course, and regulation, and of course today around agronomy. And really protecting how our members do business is a real important aspect. of the Sulfur Institute's goal. The history of the Sulfur Institute. Well, we've been around since 1960, so that's 63 years of continuous advocacy for the sulfur industry. We were formed to promote and expand the use of sulfur throughout the world, to collaborate with government and educational institutions, and to provide a central source of technical information. That's what we do, and that's our DNA. How we started was by the frash industry. The frash mining industry started by saying we need to get together and promote the use of sulfur. We expanded that from frash mining to the recovered producers like BP and all the other oil refiners throughout the world. In 2005, we expanded to other stakeholders like the transportation side of things and the equipment side of things. And then in 2016, we added sulfuric acid advocacy. We have working groups that focus on regulation, on agronomy, for instance, and our Sulfur World Symposium is really a gathering every year of our key members or of our members across the globe to get together and share our best practices. Agronomy has always been a real leading aspect for the Sulfur Institute. I think all of you on this webinar today have read this Sulfur Fertility and Fertilizers book. It's dog-eared somewhere in your library, or it sits right there at your desk. You've seen the name Dr. Samuel Tisdale. He's one of the authors. Werner Nelson, James Beaton. Both of those, James Beaton and Dr. Tisdale, were members of the Sulfur Institute during their career, with Dr. Tisdale serving for 25 years, and then the last 5 years he was president. Dr. James Beaton was the agricultural research director for TSI in 73 to 78, and he ended his career serving as a director the director for IP&I, serving the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada. Dr. John Haviland edited the latest version of this book, but we all have spent good hours learning about what goes on inside this book. I want to say something, too, about how much we appreciate the work you guys and gals do as certified crop advisors. You help tell the story, you help keep people informed, and then you invest your time like you're doing today to really build your skill set and put new tools in your toolbox to provide better service to your customers. We're guided at the Sulfur Institute by our newly formed Agronomy Steering Committee. The Agronomy Steering Committee is made up of 13 agronomists from our member companies. Dr. Alan Blaylock is the chairman of this group. We meet quarterly, and once a year we meet together at our Sulfur World Symposium to bring new ideas and to just challenge ourselves to keep telling the important story of sulfur. This year, the Agronomy Steering Committee is focusing on really telling the story that sulfur is the fourth major crop nutrient. Here's a listing of all of our members, our 63 members. We include producers that are in the upper left-hand corner, Phillips 66, Shell, BP, consumers like Advanced 6 and CH Industries, Nutrient, OCP, JR Simplot, Tessenderlo Curly, and the Mosaic Company, marketers like Rio Tinto and Satco, and service providers. Those make up our governing members. They guide the leadership of our institute. Then we have Sulfur Associates that are some of the smaller companies, Georgia Gulf Sulfur, Lithium Nevada. Lithium is becoming a very important part of the Sulfur Institute's work in collaborating and bringing new services. Our transportation associates, CSX Railroad, Gulf Transport, Iron Horse Services, all of these are important aspects in supporting our overall membership. And we have independent consultants and publishers and nonprofits that make up an important aspect of our industry, plus equipment suppliers. So this is who we are. These are listed, and you can learn more about them at the TSI website, and we'll share that in just a little bit. The importance of sulfur in the United States can't be understated. And as CCAs, we really want you to appreciate the fact that 54% of all the sulfur in the United States goes to producing phosphate fertilizer. That's 54%. Another 9% of the sulfur goes to producing pesticides, insecticides, and fungicides that are used in agriculture, and another 2% into nitrogenous fertilizers. So that's 65% of all the sulfur in the U.S. goes toward ag uses. We play an important role, CCAs, and we need to have sulfur used right, put the right prescriptions together, used for our practices, etc. One other point I want to just make before I pass the baton to Kent. In from 1980 to 2006, the TSI worked with our industry partners to do replicated scientific research in China and India across both of those large countries, because we knew then, back in 1980, that there was a big need for sulfur in those two potentially big markets. It's paid off. Sulfur is gaining use in both of those regions, and that's the kind of work that the Sulfur Institute did up until 2006. Right now, then, our work is focusing on the education side of things and helping to promote the use of sulfur on a global basis. I'm going to pass the baton to Dr. Kent Martin as he adds more to the webinar.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today and talk a little bit more about sulfur. And there's really a couple of things I'll talk about at first, and that is, what is sulfur, and give some kind of a historical perspective on sulfur. So as we know, sulfur is on the periodic table of elements. You see an image here of a very early one, 1870. A lot of us don't get to see those that look quite like that. Sulfur is very abundant in our Earth's crust. It's a very important element for a lot of applications, as Ron mentioned, industrial applications, agricultural applications. And probably the most important thing we want to take home today is the fourth most critical plant nutrient behind nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's the one that we really want to make sure that everyone understands the importance as a nutrient, and to understand how sulfur is changing over time so that we keep current with that kind of research and education. So if we think about the role of sulfur in plants, of course, there's a lot of things sulfur does. This is just a brief overview from photosynthesis to chlorophyll formation, seed production, grain production, oil, crop quality. We think about oil content, we think about protein concentration, all of these things. One interesting one actually is the amino acids. Animals and humans can't produce some amino acids that sulfur is very, very important in production of. And so it highlights sulfur's very important role in what it does in plants that benefits us, both in terms of our livestock production systems and in our human bodies. Then there's also odor and taste. We think about fruits and vegetables and things that smell, things that taste good, things that have high sugar concentrations, and the importance of sulfur in that as well. And of course, I think anytime we talk about sulfur, we have to talk about the sulfur cycle. You know, the sulfur cycle is one that, as we consider all of the dynamics that happen with sulfur, this cycle is complex and difficult to understand, maybe on the order of the nitrogen cycle. At least that's what it makes me think of initially. I think the big difference is that we have a lot more to learn about sulfur than we do on nitrogen. We've spent a lot more years learning about nitrogen. And so a lot of us, quite honestly, are a little bit behind when it comes to sulfur nutrition and fully understanding this cycle. Of course, as you look at sulfate, that's really the main thing that we would focus on as the plant available form of sulfur to the crops and to the production systems that we deal with. We think about, how do we influence that? Well, we apply fertilizer. We may apply that as a sulfate-based source that goes directly into that pool. We may apply it as an elemental source that has to go through microbial oxidation and different reactions to become available as sulfate. There's loss potential there. Sulfur can be leached, it can be reduced and sent back into the atmosphere. We can have transformations to and from organic sulfur as well. And I think the last one that I want to mention to take us to the next slide is the atmospheric deposition. So in the past, we've always recognized that we had, quote, dirty air. We had pollution in our air. And as we go into the mid 90s and the early 2000s, there were a lot of efforts made to clean up the air. And this is probably one of the most, I would say, most successful environmental projects that we can actually track and understand exactly what's happened over time. We look at this map and we think about atmospheric deposition in these industrialized areas, and we look at where we've gone from just the year 2000 to 2002 and where we are now in a map from 19 to 21, and how much we've been able to take sulfur out of the atmosphere and clean up our air. Well, what's the problem with that? Of course, we have less sulfur in the surface of our soils to utilize as a nutrient for crop production. And so since we've cleaned up our air, now we have to do something with that. Well, of course, one of the ways that was cleaned out was from industrialized activities like oil refineries. And if you look at the lower left image, you see this is a sulfur recovery unit from an oil and gas refinery. And this source of sulfur really comprises about 98% or more of the sulfur in the marketplace today. It's very pure, it's very good, it's a byproduct that we can then use and formulate to put back into the nutrient management systems of our crops. Of course, we can't go without talking about mines, because mines have been important in the past. And if you look at the image on the lower right, that's actually an image from East Java, Indonesia, where people are physically putting sulfur in baskets and carrying them out of an active volcano region and carrying them 1 to 2 miles for processing. And this actually results in a less pure, a lower quality of sulfur, but it is used today. And there are interesting stories written about it. And you can go back and, if you're on vacation or something like that, you can go look at and observe these people actually mining that out of these regions. So next, I think as kind of an intermediary, Ron mentioned importance in diseases. One of the early recognized uses in crop production was for the suppression of disease. And of course, going back into the early 1800s and even today, as we look at the image to the right, you can see that there is certainly an interaction of sulfur and disease suppression. Adequate sulfur helps to suppress disease. Without sulfur, you have increased disease incidence. And so that's certainly a very, very important role that sulfur plays. But what I'd really like to do is just step back and look at kind of a historical approach of sulfur through the years. We think about, well, how long have we known about sulfur? Well, if you go back into biblical times, sulfur is mentioned in the book of Genesis as brimstone. And there certainly are stories throughout biblical times that mention sulfur and different issues related to sulfur. And as we go through history, we can go into the 1700s when it was added to the chemical table. We can go into the 1860s when there was a large deposit discovered in Louisiana and Texas. Probably the two most important discoveries as it relates to us today is in 1923, ammonium sulfate was developed, and in 1977, we started the patenting process for sulfur bentonite. Those being two very important fertilizers in our history that has really allowed us to move forward as two main buckets of fertilizer, being the sulfate-based fertilizers and the elemental-based fertilizers. So all that history being aside, I think it's very important that we talk about more recently, so in the, let's say, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and how we have moved forward from there. There's a very, very interesting paper by Hinckley and Driscoll that plots out the changes in sulfur fertilizers relative to other fertilizer production and utilization over this period of time. And what I think is interesting, and I think we could probably call this the crux of our presentation today, is to say that we've had much faster adoption, utilization, and changes in perceptions on sulfur-based fertilizers in these recent years than any other nutrient. And that's why I think it's very important that we keep up with the recent research and recommendation systems on sulfur-based fertilizers. So just to go through this quote, they said, the increase in sulfur fertilizer has outpaced the relative rate of change in other major nutrient fertilizers, including nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, by approximately 7-fold prior to 2009, and get this, 29-fold after 2009. So let's think about that just a little bit. What have we seen happen over this time? And one of the things that I would like to point out is, and I don't want to do this to take away from anything, but Iowa State fertilizer recommendations on corn. Let's use that as an example. And why I want to use that as an example is because they've done a great job at following this, recognizing the need for sulfur, and changing their recommendation systems over time to reflect what we really need for good corn production in Iowa. So we go back to 1999, we look at some work that Antonio Malorino did, and the table you see before you right now says no significant difference in that 5-year research trial. Fast forward a couple of years to 2001, and we look at some stuff that John Sawyer did. And again, 30 plus years of data in Iowa says you don't need sulfur. And if I can read this one quote here, it says, it appears that combined sulfur supply from soil profile sulfate, atmospheric deposition, crop residue, and organic matter mineralization continues to meet crop requirements and will do so in the foreseeable future. Fascinating statement. Fast forward 6 more years, let's see what changes. You go into the 2007, 2008 sulfur response graph. Now we're recommending 15.7 pounds per acre in a fine textured soil as the economic optimum rate, and 23.4 in a coarse textured soil. So we've gone from saying there's never going to be a need for sulfur to all of a sudden we need sulfur. That's not Iowa State not looking at that correctly. That's the changes we've had in the plant soil system over those years that's created that change. So one more, if we take this forward one more step to the global story. We talk about the United States, Ron mentioned international dynamics, and certainly we see that here. US is used as the example, but certainly as we look at the world in general, we see the same thing happening. Industrialized regions are decreasing the sulfur deposition at a rapid rate. Some of these areas that don't have industrialization are low, continue to be low. And as we remove yield and product from those soils, we continue to drive that sulfur lower and lower. And so we see that emerging as more and more important as we go into the future to take care of this sulfur need and demand. So now I'll turn it over to Tristan, and he's going to cover some more of the recent current issues.
Thank you, Kent. So yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about why is sulfur important for current crop recommendations. While Kent gave a little bit of the historical perspective of where we've been, the late 90s, the early 2000s, I'm going to kind of fast forward to where we've been in the last decade, and have our sulfur recommendations kept up, and how have they been changing. As you can see on this screen, there are some images of what we might visually represent a sulfur deficiency. Whether it's soybeans on the top left, you can see those that received no sulfur compared to that had sulfur represent a more pale color green in the top part of the plant, since sulfur is immobile within the plant. Wheat on the top right, you can see maybe those hilltop parts of fields might be representing more of a pale color green. On the bottom left, you'll see alfalfa, dark rich green color that we see from adequate or sufficient sulfur, compares that in the background, shorter stunted alfalfa that did not receive it. You can also see that on the corn example on the bottom right, representing a number of different geographies across North America, where corn that adequately received sulfur, like in the background, was darker color, green, taller, and more robust. Before I get into the sulfur recommendations, I did want to take a minute, and we're going to take a poll at this time. As this poll is being generated, the question that we're going to ask is, what do you consider to be the biggest challenge in implementing sulfur nutrition in crop management? And you'll have 4 different options. You can either choose to identify sulfur deficiency in crops, balancing sulfur with other nutrients, cost and availability of sulfur-enhanced fertilizers, or the lack of clear guidelines or recommendations. So the poll should have opened up there. Take a minute at this time to fill that out or select your option. And then Marie, if I might just let you kind of give us an update of what you're seeing in the poll results, or maybe you guys are seeing it as we speak. It does not show on my screen.
Yep. It looks like people are stepping in and selecting one of these options. So please continue to do so. Looks like the leading response now is the 4th, the lack of clear guidelines or recommendations. We've got about just under half of our audience today voting. Now we're about halfway. So if you haven't responded, please just submit which one you feel resonates with you best. No right or wrong here, right? And we're about 2/3 of the way through our audience, so we'll give it like 15 more seconds or so here. The leader is still the lack of clear guidelines. The second selected would be the second one, balancing sulfur with other nutrients. Okay, we're about 3/4 of our audience. Thank you, everyone, for supplying a response here. All right, hang with me.
I think that's some additional great insight. I think I will touch on a couple of those, specifically the lack of clear guidelines. I think you'll find that this is something that's constantly evolving. I'll show some different state recommendations, how they've changed over the years, and that there's continued need and interest to reevaluate sulfur fertilizer recommendations, and that as Kent had said, that we're continuing to learn more of the specifics on the sulfur cycle and those critical components. Right. I'm going to first start by talking a little bit further about how to detect some of the sulfur deficiencies. And there are a few different options. One is soil analysis. Helps estimate the amount of sulfur that's available in the soil profile available to the crop. But I will comment that compares to soil tests such as phosphorus or potassium, the sulfur soil test may not be as consistent of a soil test as some other nutrients. It is more variable because it's a leachable nutrient, and trying to make specific recommendations, we're trying to hone in real close. It may not be the most reliable source, but it's a really good tool at telling us what trends are happening over a specific time frame, or if we're trying to identify maybe within a particular field, if we're either really high in sulfur or really low, and kind of some of those extremes. Another thing I'll just touch on briefly is plant analysis or tissue testing. I think there's a large range of crops that we can test with that, but you'll find that the concentration of sulfur is usually for most crops between 0.2 to 0.5% for a sufficiency level. The nice thing about plant tissue tests is it can give us an indication of what that sulfur is at that crop at that very specific point in time. It can change throughout the growing season based on the weather conditions and other things. So by taking multiple of these throughout the growing season, or trying to go out and say, oh, I see something visually going on, let's try to use this as a diagnostic tool to determine whether I have sulfur deficiency or not, it can be a really valuable tool. If you are seeing a visual deficiency, we maybe have already lost some of the opportunity to manage sulfur better to begin with, but I think it's a tool that can then help us tweak our recommendations for future years. And it would also highlight, why we want to combine it with things like soil analysis. So I'm going to give some examples of how soil testing has been used and what some trends are in sulfur soil test values across North America. So here's an example of some data that was pulled together from the Fertilizer Institute, their soil test summary that came out in 2020. And what this particular figure is showing is the relative frequency of sulfur deficiency. Or sufficiency, the sulfur soil test levels. They've been conducting these since the early 2000s, 2005 to 2020. Every 5 years, they do an analysis across several different labs throughout North America, and they look at what their soil test levels are for different nutrients. In this particular case, they're looking at sulfur. And they deemed that the split between deficient and sufficient may be about 3 ppm, the calcium phosphate extractant. And what we see is that to where we are today compared to where we were, that the frequency of deficiency, or the soils testing low in sulfur, has been increasing, while those that have been sufficient or adequate in sulfur have been declining in recent time. We compared these results compared to what maybe some other state recommendations might be, looking at maybe 8 ppm sulfur as being a threshold for sulfur deficiencies. We can then look at what some of those state variations are, as well as what those critical levels are across the different geographies. This image shows across North America on an individual state level, as well as different provinces, the percent sulfur soil tests that are low in sulfur, which would be shown there in black. 27 for Illinois. You look in Nebraska, 13% of the samples. Just North Florida, you got 39% of samples that are coming back low. A number of soils that are coming back low in sulfur. The colors represent the change. So if you see a green color, it actually indicates that there's more soils coming back low in sulfur. So there's an increase in deficiency. The color scheme might seem a little bit backwards. The only state that had a remarkable improvement would be that of Wisconsin. Still, nearly 30% of the soils are coming back low, but that number dropped by about over 8 ppm compared to previous years. If I dive into maybe some site-specific examples of what's happened within some states over time, I'll use Illinois as a starting example. Back in 2010, they had about 15 to 16% of their samples that were coming back low in sulfate. And if you look at that compared to the last analysis, about 27% of their soils were coming back low in sulfur, indicating that the prevalence of soils testing low in sulfur was increasing. This is not unique just to Illinois. They were seeing it in other geographies as well. And while this data comes from the Fertilizer Institute, we can look at other data sources, such as this from A&L Great Lakes, a lab that's in Indiana. And they were looking at the percentage of soils that were coming back low in sulfur across Indiana and Michigan. And this was a great example of showing how a trend had changed of the soil test levels, where in the early 2000s, they weren't really seeing any soils that were coming back low in sulfur. And then through the early 2000s, you're seeing an increase, and it kind of plateaued off into the teens, if you will. I think this is important to note that if you're taking soil tests to measure sulfur, that it can be a valuable tool, just like they identified here in Indiana and Michigan. But there are some soils that you'd have some differences in, just based on how that it's likely to hold sulfur within the soil profile. So, for example, if you look at this figure on the right coming from Wisconsin, any of the soils that have sand in them have a low potential to retain that sulfate in the root zone, or high probability of leaching. If you were to include any sort of loam throughout that soil profile, it can catch some of that sulfate, and it can have a moderate retention of that in general. However, if you have loams throughout the soil profile, or maybe clays, has a higher potential to retain that sulfate within the rooting zone. So you can see here a couple photos that would illustrate some sulfur deficiency. The question is, not all of these represent sulfur deficiency. While we're not going to take a poll on this, I might encourage you to either put in the chat or just answer yourself mentally, which of these represent sulfur deficiency if I were looking for it out in the field. And I gave you a clue on my opening slide what you might be looking for, but there's more than one right answer. I gave you the benefit of the doubt. Here, the right two images would represent sulfur deficiency. In corn, your latest or newest growth would be light yellow. Basically, it's not mobile within the plant, and we're seeing the top portions being chlorotic and showing a lack of chlorophyll. If you look at the bottom right, the difference showing light green compared to dark green in soybeans, that light green plants would be deficient in sulfur. If I compare that to the images on the left, those were on the bottom part of the canopy. This would actually be an indicator of potassium deficiency where the outer leaf margins were deficient. So a little bit of difference differentiating a few different of the deficiencies. Question might be is, where would I most likely see some of these deficiencies? Well, there's a number of different factors that can contribute to this. One is increased crop yields have higher sulfur removal and uptake. But the other thing is certain crops have higher sulfur demands. Example here would be canola with some of their compounds within there that require sulfur. They're going to have a higher proportion of sulfur within their plant tissues and the grain than other crops. Already touched on soil texture, where coarse texture soils have higher probability of leaching soil. But the organic matter within our soils can be a key factor. If you have lower organic matter soil, it may not catch some of that sulfur. And the nice thing is we can also use organic matter as a predictive tool, maybe the release rate of some sulfur to the plants. On average, and approximation, depending on mineralization, maybe 2.5 to 5 pounds of sulfur per acre per year could be mineralized for every 1% organic matter. And lastly, depending on geography you're in, if you have irrigation, I'd encourage everyone to test their irrigation well for the concentration of sulfur within it. We find that there can be a large variation between different well sources and their amount of sulfur. And some areas like that are pulling from lakes or rivers or our shallower irrigation wells might provide a majority of their crop sulfur needs based on that irrigation water quality. But it can happen where even deep wells can have higher presence of sulfur. Let's first touch base a little bit further and give some more insights on how different crop types and crop yield and uptake would influence our sulfur demand and nutrient recommendations. So here I show you nearly 20 different crops and their yield per acre as well as their total sulfur uptake. Now the sulfur uptake would be that of the total amount of sulfur that's taken up in the above ground plant portions, but it also can be that of the vegetation as well as the grain. Alfalfa is just a forage, but we have 8-ton aggressive yield, about 40 pounds of sulfur per acre that can be taken up. 35 bushel canola would be about 19 pounds of sulfur, a higher proportion per bushel. Corn, total uptake for 200 bushel corn is 33 pounds per acre of sulfur. And, if I just highlight a couple others, soybeans for 60 bushel would be about 25 pounds of sulfur total uptake throughout the growing season. And if you look at your wheats, 18 pounds for 70 bushel per acre winter wheat. I highlight this because depending on the region you're in, some will use this uptake information to estimate or predict how much sulfur they might need to apply to their crop as a fertilizer, especially if there wouldn't be much sulfur left in their soil profile and you need to resupply all the sulfur needs for that crop the following year. Another option, though, is to look at sulfur removal. This might be a more conservative recommendation, but if I give a couple examples of like the corn and soybean of what their sulfur removal is, this is just the sulfur that's in the grain. So in corn, it's 0.08, or I like to use the general rule, it's about 0.1 pounds of sulfur per bushel, or say 1 pound of sulfur per 10 bushels of corn. So 200 bushel corn crop is going to be 20 pounds of sulfur that's taken up. Now, this is going to be either depleting your soils this much every year, unless there's some sulfur coming in from an external resource, whether it's a manure, fertilizer, or even an atmospheric deposition on those fields. Soybeans, it's about 0.18, about 0.2 pounds of sulfur per bushel. Over that of twice that of what the corn requirements were. But due to the lower yield levels, we have 12 pounds of sulfur per 60 bushel yield level of soybeans. Sulfur is also incredibly important in relationship to nitrogen. Kent had briefly illustrated earlier about the importance of methionine and cysteine, those amino acids that are essential for plant growth. You'll notice when you look at these compounds that sulfur is taken up in relationship with nitrogen. Both of those are in the same compounds. And depending on the crop species, they'll be taken up in different ratios. So for some of the small grains, we might see a nitrogen to sulfur ratio of about 10 to 1. Corn is about 15 to 1. And then you can look at some of those high sulfur demand crops like your your rape or mustards, it can range from 7 to 3 pounds of nitrogen to 1 pound of sulfur. The reason that I highlight this is that many times if you guys have been accustomed to applying nitrogen to your crops, that there really should be some sulfur being applied at the same time, or making sure that's available for other resources in addition to what the nitrogen is for the crop. And I'll give some examples of why this is important for crop yield and quality. So in this example, we look at corn grain yield. It's actually in grams per plant, so don't let the units fool you on the left axis. On the right axis, we look at a protein within that grain. And then on the bottom axis, we don't look at individually nitrogen or sulfur, but we're looking at the ratio. So on the right side, we'd be a higher proportion of nitrogen and less sulfur. On the left side, with a lower nitrogen to sulfur ratio, there's more sulfur, less nitrogen. And what we see for both yield and quality being protein, is that it's more of your quadratic shaped formulas or curves where it's really somewhere in the middle. You need a balance between nitrogen and sulfur to be most effective for increasing corn yield and quality. Now you'll note here that they kind of give a range of what was most beneficial ratio for either yield or that of grain is 12.2 to 14 to 1 parts nitrogen to sulfur. And if you remember what I said on the previous slide, corn nitrogen sulfur ratio is about 15 to 1. So we're close on that. The other thing you highlight here on the yield component of the nitrogen to sulfur ratio is, I've talked again with progressive growers, oftentimes when they're going for your higher yields, they're trying to make their nitrogen work more efficiently. They'll push their nitrogen to sulfur ratio down a little bit and maybe apply a little bit more sulfur to make a better utilization of their nitrogen. That brings me to another component of how sulfur helps aid in increasing nutrient use efficiency and nitrogen. On the image on the left here, we have nitrate uptake, nitrogen uptake, you can think of it. On the left, we have adequate sulfur, and then on the gray bars, it's the number of days that we starved or took sulfur away from the crop. And you notice that over time, that the further that we deprive the crop of sulfur, that the nitrate uptake was reduced. In other words, we did not have as efficient plants to utilize that nitrate that was originally there. We left nitrogen out in the profile. On the right, we can take it all the way to grain yield. Here, grain yields in kilograms per hectare. For those in other geographies that are used to that, for those that are still accustomed to pounds per acre, you can just convert these units by multiplying by about 0.9. Here we look at 4 different nitrogen rates ranging from 0 to 120 pounds of nitrogen and 3 different sulfur rates ranging from 0 to 60. You'll notice if we didn't apply any sulfur initially, that this study looked at increasing nitrogen, increased yield. However, if you were to apply just 30 pounds of sulfur or kilograms of sulfur per hectare, that first increment of sulfur was just as beneficial as even the highest units of nitrogen in 0 sulfur plots. That sulfur really had a large effect on the grain yield, and you could potentially get better utilization by using lower nitrogen rates. It wasn't until your highest sulfur and nitrogen rate where they were really reaching maybe an optimum, but those lower nitrogen rates didn't need that higher sulfur application rate. So at this point, I've probably hopefully articulated how sulfur has been deficient, why we're using it as an important component for increasing grain quality and yields. But having to address what fertilizer options do we have? Well, there's a number of different options that we have here: dry formulations or liquid formulations, and the percent of sulfur within each of those products. We have some of those, the older products that have, kind of the standards, ammonium sulfate, which is really common for dry products, or ammonium thiosulfate for liquids. Then you got into the developed products, the elemental sulfurs, more of your slow release, whether it's bentonite or elemental. There's a number of different products here. I will highlight manure. It can be a great sulfur fertilizer source, but the concentration of sulfur within the different manure types can vary quite a bit, and estimating the predictability of when it will release. You can see here that there's a number of different products, some that contain macronutrients like potassium, magnesium, and sulfate that has 21 to 22% sulfur, as well as potassium or magnesium. Some of the newer products have sulfur enhanced phosphates, which contain maybe multiple forms of sulfur within different fertilizer granules to help match nutrient uptake compared to that of our crop needs. And that leads me to how has fertilizers evolved. There's currently an opportunity for sulfurs to be enhanced efficiency fertilizers. That's designated or controlled, moderated by the Association of Plant Food Control Officials, which is APCO. And one of their standards for slow release properties or having dual forms of sulfur release is that they have to have at least a 15% of the sulfur that's within that granule or within that liquid product would meet one of the following criteria to be an EEF. That's 15% that sulfur has to be either insoluble, has to be coated in a form that's going to be slow release on top of a granule, or it has to be occluded, which is basically built within the granule so that it can release at different times. Or the fourth option, more related to nitrogen, is products that contain water-soluble nitrogen that can release. So there are enhanced efficiency fertilizer formulations of sulfur out there that can increase their availability. The last thing I wanted to bring is just what are a couple of the state recommendations. The recommendations have varied over time. If I look at an example of one of the earlier sulfur recommendations, this is from Illinois. They use soil tests as their standard. I will say that they're currently revising these or reviewing their recommendations, seeing if these needed updated. Their recommendations were, soils would be considered very low in sulfur if it was 0 to 12 pounds per acre. This would be 0 to 6 ppm. Low if it was 12 to 22 pounds per acre, or 6 to 11 ppm, and response was not likely if it was over 11 ppm. And this was last updated in 2009. If I fast forward to 2012, some of the Wisconsin recommendations, they took a different approach. They were looking more by crop species and what their nutrient uptake demands were. Forages were high demands, 15 to 25 pounds per acre on established stands, or incorporation as seeding was really important for getting the crop off to a good start. But if you look at a majority of the row crops and small grains, 10 to 25 pounds of sulfur is generally what they recommended. And this was updated in 2012. More recently, in 2014, the University of Nebraska updated their recommendations, and they took a little bit more comprehensive approach. They combined multiple different factors, including sulfur soil test levels, some different thresholds here, 6 to 8. They also looked at soil organic matter, either less than or greater than 1 ppm, as well as how much sulfur was in their irrigation water. And then depending on whether they were broadcasting or banding or row applying their fertilizer, they could range from either nothing up to 20 pounds per acre of sulfur recommendations, depending on their scenario. Most recently, one state that updated their recommendations in 2023 was the University of Minnesota. Their recommendations is specific to corn in this example, and they took into a few different factors as well. They looked at drainage, soil organic matter percent, as well as the crop rotation. So when, whether it was a well-drained or poor-drained following a soybean or wheat rotation, it could range from 0 up to 25 pounds of sulfur per acre recommendation. Their corn-on-corn recommendations always required some sulfur, 5 to 25 pounds per acre, as well as their sandy or coarse soils. I highlight this because sulfur recommendations are local, and they are changing and being updated by the states continually. And I think it's wise for us always to continue to encourage ourselves, as what we believed 5 or 10 years ago still relevant today, or is there opportunities to maybe to enhance some of these? I think if there was looking at some metadata analysis and review, this was looking at just the high demand sulfur crop recommendations, more specialty crops, either your winter cereals, your canolas and rapeseeds, pulses, forages. Their recommendation in 2021 was, based on a crop nutrient removal and uptake requirement. Some of these rates that they were recommending in this meta-analysis were higher than what we'd customarily seed in many different geographies. Some might look at it on a per cut basis or certain monthly intervals. I think all this just highlights that we continue to challenge how we're applying our sulfur fertilizer, and whether our recommendations are meeting our crop nutrient uptake demands and needs. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kent and let him give a couple other considerations on some resources that you guys have available to yourselves.
Thanks, Tristan. So I really want to just kind of wrap this up because as we've talked about through all this presentation, there's a lot of information about sulfur and a lot of ways to better understand or better predict when you have a sulfur problem. So one of the things we like to see people do is we really like to see people go out and observe their crops, their fields, to get a better understanding of where those sulfur deficiencies might take place. Tristan mentioned several of these things with yellowing on the new plant growth because sulfur is not mobile in the plant, so it always appears on the top, not to confuse that with nitrogen deficiency. We have that interveinal chlorosis that we see. Because sulfur is important in cell growth and division, we see shortened internodes, we see short plants. Sometimes at certain points of the season, you'll see a very drastic, erratic difference in plant growth or yellowing, as you see in the lower left image, where you'll have a very green, healthy plant right next to something that's very yellowed, stunted, and looks like it has poor growth. Consider the soil conditions. We know that sometimes the soil test is difficult for correlation and calibration to a response to sulfur application. But if we can look at sulfate levels in the soil, look at organic matter levels, look at the history of the incidence of deficiency, consider if it's an eroded area, if it's been leveled, if anything has taken organic matter that might regularly contribute to higher sulfur levels, and if that's removed, then consider that as a way to predict that sulfur response. And then consider the crop. The graph in the lower right, I think Tristan has done a good job of covering that certain crops are important for sulfur application. You'll see greater responses to that sulfur application, and this is just an example of nitrogen and sulfur applications in canola. And so when you look at high oil producing crops, legumes, trying to push protein, trying to push quality, all these things will be very important. And really what we want to do is just to highlight that the Sulfur Institute is what we are developing and have developed and continue to develop as the resource for all these things considering sulfur. And so this image you see now is what the homepage of the Sulfur Institute website would look like. But if you continue on, you can find a lot of different resources on the website. These are continually being developed and modified. And so you see, nutrient management for alfalfa, canola, corn, cotton, soybean, wheat, barley. You can continue on and find basic information about sulfur, different countries, information about the sulfur cycle, information about other states, and then you can look at basic information. And so we've really tried to utilize this as an opportunity that you can go to the TSI website and you can get all these different pieces of information that might be relevant to you, can help you to dive into more current information and data on sulfur, and then take you, of course, back to recommendation systems that can guide you into the future. We focused on housing educational and training kind of one-stop shop where you can go to find that information. And so you can go to the website and find that. And just to highlight that there are a lot of people that volunteer their time and efforts and knowledge and experience to pour into this so that you as an agronomist or as a soil scientist or professional can go here to find this information. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ron and we'll do one more poll question and then we'll wrap it up and go to questions.
Thank you, Kent and Tristan. Marie, I will defer to you as this gets polled.
Yep. So the question is, which topic would you most like to learn about? The options here are sulfur nutrition and role in plant growth development, heat stress and plant development, and specifically management strategies, fundamentals of the sulfur fertilizer market, and is the sulfur cycles changing? So it looks like we're getting in responses here. The leader of the pack is heat stress and plant development and management, with the second being the first, funny phrasing, sulfur nutrition and role in the plant growth and development. We've got about a quarter of our audience that's given some feedback here. Just give it a few more seconds. One of the questions or a number of questions have come in. Thank you everyone for submitting your questions. I've been sending them to our panelists here. And I think when we close the poll, my question that we could kick off would be just a few, I guess, your insight on the timing and the use of sulfur fertilizers in conjunction with other nutrient sources, specifically nitrogen. We have a number of questions that circle about that. All right, so right now the leader is sulfur nutrition and role in plant growth. So I'm going to close the poll and share that quickly so you can all see that. And again, this will all be in that recording. And I'll hide it now. So,
perfect. Ron, I'll let you speak on this the next slide, and then I'll answer that question about sulfur timing.
Okay, this is just an announcement that our annual Sulfur World Symposium, we rotate every other year, either we're in the US or in Europe. One of our member companies in Europe. This year we're in South Carolina at the Charleston, and that particular symposium is April 2nd to the 4th. Just it's for members only, but it's just wanted to make you aware you can learn about this symposium on the website and get further information by just regularly checking that. Next slide. All right, Tristan has called out this paper, the paper called Revisiting Sulfur, the Once Neglected Nutrient, Its Roles in Plant Growth, Metabolism, Stress Tolerance, and Crop Production. We leave this slide for you to be as a reference because it's really a nutshell of the things that we, the Agronomy Steering Committee at the Sulfur Institute, is considering and looking at on areas where we need to focus our attention to help gather information, and where researchers have been suggested they look at these very key topics to bring sulfur nutrition, keep advancing it in the priority that it needs. So we'll leave you with that food for thought. If you don't have that paper, go out on the internet and find it. And I want to thank Tristan and Kent for the great work and the collaboration and working with them and helping the Sulfur Institute put this forward. And I want to thank the American Society of Agronomy for helping us deliver this. But I really want to thank all of you for investing in your lifelong learning program and learning more about sulfur today. There are some great questions I've been looking at. Marie, tell us, Tristan, I'll come back to Tristan. He was going to answer the typing.
Yeah, so the first question that Maria had stated was about the sulfur timing. And as an agronomist, I'll say it depends, but it depends on a couple things. One is looking at your soil types. If you're on a more of a sandy soil type, I think you have to look at ways to spoon feed that crop, either by split applications of your timing, likely what you'd be doing with your nitrogen as well. So a little bit of sulfur in there. Or you could also be looking at different forms of sulfur and trying to layer them in. Like, for example, you could have a fertilizer source that has some sulfate available early, and then you could have something where you're pairing it with some sort of an elemental sulfur to for the elemental sulfur, it's going to break down more slowly and be your late season sulfur needs depending on the crop. We didn't show any nutrient uptake curves of sulfur, but it followed that very similar to what nitrogen would on most of the crops, where your most rapid uptake periods can be during your peak growth period for the crop. So you want to make sure your sulfur is sufficient there. But also I'd probably err on the side of applying it a little earlier than late, because some of this comes from your organic matter in your soil. And if you're not mineralizing your organic matter early in the growing season, front loading some of that sulfur can be more beneficial.
Marie, one of the questions I saw was someone asked about the comment of the reliability of the sulfur soil test. I've been in this business 48, 49 years, and that question's been asked, of me or anyone else for that length of time, and we have improved it in the last 45, 48 years, but we also have learned how to improve the way we take the samples. If I'm diagnosing a problem, whether it be canola, corn, soybeans, whatever the crop is, and I see a variation in the field, I'm going to go to that good looking corn. I'm going to take soil samples and plant samples. I'm going to look at the bad crop. I'm going to do the same thing, good soil sample, good plant sample, and I'm going to compare the differences. To my way of thinking, and my experience has taught me, I can make a very good scientific recommendation to that grower by doing that. If I only am going to collect a soil sample to make a diagnosis, no, I'm going to come up short probably. I like the overall soil test summary that Tristan shared with us to give us the trends of what's going on. That's important. And so don't get discouraged or don't listen too hard to how bad the soil test is for sulfur, because there's a great way to work around it, I've found, in the last 25 years of my career, that you look at the good corn, look at the bad corn, or good crop, bad crop, and make your decisions accordingly.
And Ron, to take that one step further, there were a couple of comments that were in regard to increasing the recommendations of sulfur over time, which is the reflection of those people watching that tendency for the deficiencies in certain fields, certain crops, developing that history and then making that recommendation. And that is certainly something that we see, and I get comments about all the time, that agronomists that traditionally would recommend 10, 15 pounds 20 years ago, today are recommending 20, 30, and 40 pounds and seeing additional responses to that. And as they go through that process and as they are more in tune to the sulfur fertilization, not only the sulfur soil test, but the organic matter and the plants displaying the deficiency, they're getting greater and greater confidence on recommending that sulfur for a positive crop response.
A couple other things looking in the chat, looking at some of the questions that came in. One was looking at the dry weather, how drought conditions. Sulfur primarily moves to the crop through mass flow, so it needs water just like that of nitrogen. So in dry conditions, plants are going to be, it's going to be tougher for them to get the adequate sulfur they need. But sulfur is going to be moving through the profile. It's mobile within the soil, but not within the plant. So, nitrogen or excess rainfall would be moving that sulfate deeper. Now, without excess rainfall, there's a likelihood that some of that sulfate could carry over, depending on what kind of winter and other things that we have. If you get a bunch of winter snow and rain, majority of that could leach. Another comment that I saw in their question was about detecting sulfur deficiency from maybe some sort of NDVI or NDRE. To my knowledge, there's some applicability of that. The challenge is trying to differentiate it from nitrogen. Now, because there can be some similarities, well, nitrogen deficiency will primarily be on the lower part of the plant. It often can exhibit that yellowing differences in color. There might be a couple wavelengths that could differentiate the nutrients a little bit, but primarily from a farmer perspective, what I've seen is a lot of times just trying to fertilize or correct the sulfur deficiencies. You may not know if it's sulfur or nitrogen from those spectral differences unless you're doing some ground truthing with some tissue test or soil test to verify which nutrient is truly deficient. But it can tell you relative differences throughout the field.
Yeah, so Tristan, on that one, we would expect, as you look at NDVI, we'd expect the red band